who began to holloa aloud in a wild, chanting tone. "I am Theodoric of Engaddi. I am the torch brand of the desert. I am the flail of the infidels. The lion and the leopard shall be my comrades, and draw nigh to my cell for shelter. Neither shall the goat be afraid of their fangs. I am the torch and the lantern. Kyrie eleison." He closed his song by a short race, and ended that again by 3 forward bounds, which would have done him great credit in a gymnastic academy, but became his character of hermit so indifferently that the Scottish knight was altogether confounded and bewildered. The Saracen seemed to understand him better. "You see," he said, "that he expects us to follow him to his cell, which, indeed, is our only place of refuge for the night. You are the leopard, from the portrait of your shield. I am the lion, as my name imports. And by the goat, alluding to his garb of goatskins, he means himself. We must keep him in sight, however, for he is as fleet as a dromedary." In fact, the task was a difficult one, for though the reverend guide stopped from time to time, and waved his hand as if to encourage them to come on, yet, well acquainted with all the winding dells and passes of the desert, and gifted with uncommon activity, which perhaps an unsettled state of mind kept in constant exercise, he led the knights through chasms and along footpaths, where even the light-armed Saracen, with his well-trained barb, was in considerable risk, and where the iron-sheathed European and his overburdened steed found themselves in such imminent peril as the rider would have gladly exchanged for the dangers of general action. Glad he was when, at length, after this wild race, he beheld the holy man who had led it standing in front of a cavern, with a large torch in his hand, composed of a piece of wood dipped in bitumen, which cast a broad and flickering light, and emitted a strong sulphurous smell. Undeterred by the stifling vapour, the knight threw himself from his horse and entered the cavern, which afforded small appearance of accommodation. The cell was divided into 2 parts, in the outward of which were an altar of stone and a crucifix made of reeds. This served the anchorite for his chapel. On one side of this outward cave the Christian knight, though not without scruple, arising from religious reverence to the objects around, fastened up his horse, and arranged him for the night in imitation of the Saracen, who gave him to understand that such was the custom of the place. The hermit, meanwhile, was busied putting his inner apartment in order to receive his guests, and there they soon joined him. At the bottom of the outer cave, a small aperture, closed with a door of rough plank, led into the sleeping apartment of the hermit, who was more commodious. The floor had been brought to a rough level by the labour of the inhabitant, and then strewed with white sand, which he daily sprinkled with water from a small fountain which bubbled out of the rock in one corner, affording in that stifling climate refreshment alike to the ear and the taste. Mattresses wrought of twisted flags lay by the side of the cell. The sides, like the floor, had been roughly brought to shape, and several herbs and flowers were hung around them. The 2 waxen torches which the hermit lighted gave a cheerful air to the place, which was rendered agreeable by its fragrance and coolness. There were implements of labour in one corner of the apartment. In another was a niche for a rude statue of the Virgin. A table and 2 chairs showed that they must be the handiwork of the anchorite, being different in their form from Oriental accommodations. The former was covered, not only with reeds and pulse, but also with dried flesh, which Theodoric assiduously placed in such arrangements as should invite the appetite of his guests. This appearance of courtesy, though mute, and expressed by gestures only, seemed to Sir Kenneth something entirely irreconcilable with his former wild and violent demeanour. The movements of the hermit were now become composed, and apparently it was only a sense of religious humiliation which prevented his features, emaciated as they were by his austere mode of life, from being majestic and noble. He trod his cell as one who seemed born to rule over men, but who had abdicated his empire to become the servant of heaven. Still, it must be allowed that his gigantic size, the length of his unshaven locks and beard, and the fire of a deep-set and wild eye, were rather attributes of a soldier than a recluse. Even the Saracen seemed to regard the anchorite with some veneration, while he was thus employed, and he whispered in a low tone to Sir Kenneth, "The Hamako is now in his better mind, but he will not speak until we have eaten, such is his vow." It was in silence, accordingly, that Theodorick motioned to the Scot to take his place on one of the low chairs, while Sheerkohf placed himself, after the custom of his nation, upon a cushion of mats. The hermit then held up both hands, as if blessing the refreshment which he had placed before his guests, and they proceeded to eat in silence as profound as his own. To the Saracen this gravity was natural, and the Christian imitated his taciturnity, while he employed his thoughts on the singularity of his own situation, and the contrast betwixt the wild, furious gesticulations, loud cries, and fierce actions of Theodorick when they first met him, and the demure, solemn, decorous assiduity with which he now performed the duties of hospitality. When their meal was ended, the hermit, who had not eaten himself a morsel, removed the fragments from the table, and placing before the Saracen a pitcher of sherbet, assigned to the Scot a flask of wine. "Drink," he said, "my children." They were the first words he had spoken. "The gifts of God are to be enjoyed when the giver is remembered." Having said this, he retired to the outward cell, probably for performance of his devotions, and left his guests together in the inner apartment, when Sir Kenneth endeavoured, by various questions, to draw from Sheerkohf what the Emir knew concerning his host. He was interested by more than mere curiosity in these inquiries. Difficult as it was to reconcile the outrageous demeanour of the recluse at his first appearance with his present humbled and placid behaviour, it seemed yet more impossible to think it consistent with the high consideration in which, according to what Sir Kenneth had learned, this hermit was held by the most enlightened divines of the Christian world. Theodorick, the hermit of Engaddi, had, in that character, been the correspondent of popes and councils, to whom his letters, full of eloquent fervour, had described the miseries imposed by the unbelievers upon the Latin Christians in the Holy Land, in colours scarce inferior to those employed at the Council of Clermont by the hermit Peter, when he preached the first Crusade. To find, in a person so reverend and so much revered, the frantic gestures of a mad fakir, induced the Christian knight to pause ere he could resolve to communicate to him certain important matters which he had in charge from some of the leaders of the Crusade. It had been a main object of Sir Kenneth's pilgrimage, attempted by a route so unusual, to make such communications. But what he had that night seen induced him to pause and reflect ere he proceeded to the execution of his commission. From the Emir he could not extract much information, but the general tenor was as follows: that, as he had heard, the hermit had been once a brave and valiant soldier, wise in council and fortunate in battle, which last he could easily believe from the great strength and agility which he had often seen him displayed; that he had appeared at Jerusalem in the character not of a pilgrim, but in that of one who had devoted himself to dwell for the remainder of his life in the Holy Land. Shortly afterwards he fixed his residence amid the scenes of desolation where they now found him, respected by the Latins for his austere devotion, and by the Turks and Arabs on account of the symptoms of insanity which he displayed, and which they ascribed to inspiration. It was from them he had the name of Hamako, which expresses such a character in the Turkish language. Sheerkohf himself seemed at a loss how to rank their host. He had been, he said, a wise man, and could often, for many hours, speak lessons of virtue or wisdom, without the slightest appearance of inaccuracy. At other times he was wild and violent, but never before had he seen him so mischievously disposed as he had that day appeared to be. His rage was chiefly provoked by an affront to his religion,